Let's talk a little bit more about this issue. Lester Spence is a professor of political science and Africana studies, Johns Hopkins University in the United States of America. He joins us now. Very good evening to you, Lisa Time, and thank you so much for joining us. So, according to some stats here, the Gun Violence Archive says there have been 233 mass shootings in the U.S. this year alone. So let's see the arguments, the debate in Congress and what's influencing them. I believe that in order for any of the laws to pass, the Republicans in the Senate need to back them. What exactly is preventing them from backing them?
Well, their politics are driven by a very narrow conception of liberty. And that conception of liberty, as it ties to the United States Constitution's Second Amendment, basically says that people should have broad, the ability of people to own guns should only be limited in very, 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 very narrow circumstances. And none of these circumstances, we haven't had the circumstances that would cause the Republican Party to take another approach as it relates to that.
So even if some are privately sympathetic to stricter gun controls, as one analyst suggested, they may apparently also fear the electoral consequences of supporting them. Is it something that evenly cuts across all demographics? I mean, the fear that you may be walking down somewhere, whether it be school, in a hospital, in a grocery store, and you're confronted by a mass shooter.
Well, here's a way to think about it. My son, my youngest son, lives in Texas. He lives in Texas with his mother. So I get a text the day of, and it says, school shooting in Texas. Now, the school shooting was in an elementary school, for children ages like 6 to 12 or 6 to 13. So that's older. That's way younger than my son. But for a second, I had to think about, it hit me home. I was like, wow, is this my kid? And that happens far often than not in the United States over the past year or so. And actually, if you go back further, we've been concerned with this, and it makes the United States unique. But the one thing I would push back on, because as you're telling the story, it makes it seem for the viewer or the listener that this is a Republican Party thing. The reality is it's actually not just a Republican Party thing. Legislation can pass curbing gun use in the United States Senate if we only had 51 votes. But because of the structure of the Senate, we need 60 votes to pass anything. Now, you can change that vote dynamic in the Senate just with Democratic Party votes alone, but there have been 2 Democratic Party senators who've been unwilling to do so. So, so I get articulating this as if this is a Republican Party thing, and to an extent it is. But we have to really talk about the broader structure and that bipartisan dynamic.
Okay, let's talk about that. The possible areas of agreement, bipartisan agreement, I believe that involves red flag laws, which let authorities take guns from people at higher risk of harming themselves or others. But it's not always obvious, is it?
Well, so there's bipartisan agreement as articulated in the media, that is in newspapers in the United States and TV shows in the United States, talk shows, et cetera, and then internationally. But then there's actual votes. So there are no actual bipartisan votes for reasonable gun regulation. There aren't any. And there aren't any, not just because of the Republican Party dynamics, that you'd have to get, given the United States Senate structure the way it's structured now, you'd have to get 10 Republican votes. There aren't 10 Republican votes for any common sense legislation. There are, on the other hand, approximately 49, 50, 51 votes on the Democratic side. If the Democratic Party were to get rid of the filibuster in the Senate, they'd be able to do it. So we can talk about, so when we're talking about gun legislation or a range of other issues. What it really gets to is the willingness of the Democratic Party to change the Senate in a way to make to pass their legislation.
No, sure, and I get that, but it's also important to understand if there are areas of consensus, and that's why I was asking.
There aren't any.
There aren't any.
But, no, I get it. I get it. There aren't any. So what's going to happen with what happens with this? What happens is something like this happens, and then there's a mass shooting, and then there's a range of outrage, and then what happens is Republican legislators will talk about things they agree on, but they'll never cast votes. It's important in the media to really to get that right. It's not about, what rhetorical things that people agree with. It's like, okay, when have the people who suggested on the Republican Party side that they'll support common sense legislation, when have they voted for it? And they haven't. The last time they did was decades ago.
And I mean, Mr. Biden spoke about that, in 1994, that assault-style weapons ban that he helped pass, but that lapsed after a period of time. So doesn't need sort of an evergreen policy? Why would you set up something to stem a tide if it actually has a time limit?
Oh, right. So that time limit dynamic, I think, was the only way they could get bipartisan support. Mm-hmm. So now what we would need is something far more robust, but it's something that's not time limited. But again, we wouldn't need that for bipartisan support because there isn't. What we need that for is in order to stem the violence that the Republican Party and that the conservative movement that's taken over the Republican Party thinks naturally comes with their conception of liberty and their strong support for the Second Amendment.
Is at least Democratic support within the party for the democratic-led Protecting Our Act Kids Act, which combines, I believe, 8 different gun control bills, which include many of the proposals that Mr. Biden spoke about on Thursday.
Yes, there is almost unanimous consent. But the problem, again, is that when it gets to the Senate, there is almost unanimous consent for changing the Senate such that a vote like that can pass it just with Democratic votes. But there have been 2 holdouts, Manchin in West Virginia and Sinema in Arizona. And they've been unwilling to change the Senate structure to allow for a Democratic vote.
Okay, I just want to get a sense of what's happening elsewhere. So the U.S. Supreme Court is also deliberating on one of the nation's most restrictive gun laws in New York that places tight restrictions on who can carry a gun in public. Because of the federal nature of the United States, is this also part of the problem?
Yes, it is. And this is where the Republican Party has been incredibly successful. So let's say that, so what's going to happen with that New York bill is the Supreme Court is likely going to find it unconstitutional, which will mean that the bill is null and void. Let's say that we actually get the vote somehow in the House and the Senate to pass legislation. Given how conservative the Supreme Court is as a result of Republican Party action, it is not difficult to imagine a scenario in which they even find that unconstitutional. Now, that doesn't mean that the Democratic Party should do nothing. What it means is that the Democratic Party has to be a lot more aggressive at thinking about this issue and the range of other issues as part of a broader attempt to remake government, to pass legislation that actually meets Americans' needs. Because the one thing that we do have major support for is if you actually do public opinion, if you look at public opinion, like vast majorities of American citizens believe in gun control legislation of some sort. It's just that the Republican Party doesn't, and then that the Democratic Party doesn't want to change the Senate such that they can actually enact policy for that for those majorities.
So in simple layman's terms, as you've suggested, if the justices strike down the law, following this hearing that we had in November, does that suggest that there might be state-level bans across the nation on assault-style weapons and high-capacity magazines that could end up being?
I think. Yeah. So even if the justices strike down the law, what you probably see is states attempting to pass laws just to kind of poke and prod and see what type of openings there are, but also to generate the type of majorities to make the type of really transformative change possible. So in that way, if people keep up, even striking the laws down, as long as they continue to appear, can actually produce a positive politics. But we have to we really have to be a lot more strategic and tactical about this stuff.
From your perspective, and also leaning from academia, I'm sure there's been lots of studies, lots of research. What are the psychosocial reasons behind why it's more likely to happen in the United States than anywhere else?
So part of this is just gun availability. And then a big part of that Second Amendment support, I think, is connected to increasing polarization, to increasing economic inequality, to increase sense of kind of white resentment and white anger. That's basically that basically Republican Party is taking advantage of. And it's funny because we don't really talk about that racial dynamic enough about this, right? So one way to think about it is the Second Amendment, which gives people the right to bear arms, is to whites what to 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which gave rights to African Americans, is to blacks. So I think that the racial politics behind that Second Amendment plays a very significant role in why we see these type of events happening in the United States more so than anywhere else.
I mean, also the First Amendment, and this is just the impression that one gets, that the ability and the push for the right thereof to say what you want, particularly even if you're speaking about gun control, irrespective of whom it's targeted at, and how that in itself can trigger a reaction that leads to mass shootings, that there seems to be a great deal of protection over that First Amendment right to be able to spew hate speech or whatever it is that can galvanize people to act in a manner that is completely against the spirit thereof.
No, that's absolutely right. I'm laughing because I was thinking in my head, like, the Second Amendment has really been weaponized. And of course it is. But I think the United States is on the precipice of something really, 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 really troubling. And it isn't hyperbolic to say that the Second Amendment lies, if it's not at the center of it, is very near the center.
Thank you so much for speaking to us. Pity we have run out of time, but much appreciated. Speaking to us there is Lester Spencer. He is a professor of political science and Africana studies at Johns Hopkins University in the United States of America.